In the heart of Riverton, a young boy named Leo hides beneath an old bridge, haunted by the shadows of a past he can't remember. Night after night, the hauntingly beautiful sound of Ava's violin pulls him out, unraveling memories of a song that once kept him safe. But when a mysterious figure emerges, claiming to be his uncle, dark truths resurface, threatening their fragile bond and Leo's safety. Can Ava's music heal the scars of a forgotten past? And will Leo find the courage to face what hides in the shadows of his memory? The wind swept through the town like an unseen hand, carrying the chill of late autumn down the narrow alleys and across the crumbling cobblestones. Beneath the old stone bridge at the edge of Riverton, Leo shivered, curling into himself as twilight fell. The jagged sound of the river whispered harshly below, mocking the silence that had become his only companion. The boy's medium-brown skin was dirt-streaked, and his wide eyes, bright yet shadowed by hunger, scanned the dark corners as if watching for ghosts. Leo couldn't remember how long it had been since he first sought refuge here. The bridge's cold, rough stones offered little comfort, but it was better than the nights on busier streets, where strangers cast glances that ranged from pity to threat. He tugged a tattered blanket closer around his shoulders, its edges frayed like the broken thoughts that kept flickering in his mind. Flashes of faces, firelight, and the echo of a lullaby he couldn't place. The sun dipped below the horizon, surrendering to the deep blues and purples of evening. A sudden, soft sound broke through the rush of water. Leo sat up, heart thudding in his chest as he strained to hear. The melody floated on the wind, fragile but deliberate. It was a violin, its notes weaving a story full of longing and solace. The song seemed to pull at something deep inside him, unraveling a knot of fear he hadn't known was there. Peeking out from his stone sanctuary, he saw her, a young woman standing beneath the glow of a nearby street lamp, eyes closed, fingers dancing deftly over the strings of her instrument. She was alone, her medium brown skin luminous in the soft light, her hair tied back in a loose knot. The notes she played were neither joyful nor mournful, but something in between, like a secret whispered to the stars. For a moment, Leo felt warm, as if the music itself had wrapped around him, pushing back the cold that had settled in his bone. He watched as the woman played, the violin singing of hope and loss in equal measure. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. Leo gasped and shrank back, heart pounding as he pressed his back to the rough stone, afraid to breathe. But Ava, the busker with the violin, had already seen him. Ava lowered her bow slowly, letting the final note hang in the air before dissolving into the murmur of the river and the whispering wind. She scanned the shadows under the bridge, where she'd caught the flicker of movement. There was no mistaking the bright eyes that had peered out at her, wide and haunted, like those of a deer caught mid-flight. A pang of recognition hit her chest. She knew that look well. She'd seen it in her own reflection more times than she could count after the accident. "Hey," she called softly, her voice careful not to disturb the quiet. Silence answered, save for the river lapping against the stone. She took a tentative step forward, the old boards of the wooden path creaking beneath her. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, setting her violin down gently by her feet. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure why she'd stopped playing to approach this hidden figure. Perhaps it was the way the boy's eyes had looked at her, like he knew the story she played, felt the song's pain and its fleeting promise. The boy stayed hidden, breath shallow, fighting the urge to run. His heart felt like a trapped bird, wings flapping desperately inside his chest. But hunger gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. Ava sighed, lifting a small bundle from her satchel and unwrapping it with deliberate slowness. The aroma of fresh bread and cheese wafted into the air, cutting through the damp scent of river moss. She placed the bundle on the stone, just at the edge of the shadows, and backed away. "If you're hungry, it's yours," she said, her eyes soft and steady. She picked up her violin and stepped back into the lamplight, resuming her song, though this time it was gentler, coaxing. The notes rose and fell like the story of a tired traveler finding shelter, each measure a question, each pause an invitation. Leo watched her, his mouth dry. The warmth of the bread called to him, the simple act of kindness both confusing and tempting. He reached out slowly, hand trembling, and dragged the bundle into his lap. The crust was warm, the cheese soft, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a bite. As the music continued, he felt a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't know why it came, only that the song seemed to understand, seemed to say, "You are not alone." Ava played on, catching a glimpse of movement as Leo shifted deeper into the light. He took another bite, his shoulders visibly relaxing, eyes no longer darting. A faint smile touched Ava's lips. She didn't know his name or why he was here, but she knew enough. Enough to play, enough to wait. The days that followed settled into a quiet pattern. Every evening, as the sky darkened and the city lights shimmered to life, Ava returned to her usual spot near the bridge. She played songs that told of faraway places, memories shared in the language of strings. And every night, Leo emerged a little more from the safety of the shadows, sitting close enough to hear the scrape of her bow as it slid over the strings, but still just far enough to run if he needed to. Ava kept her distance, never pressing him for more than he was ready to give. Instead, she left small meals on the edge of the bridge, sandwiches, fruit, sometimes a warm pastry from the local bakery. Each time Leo accepted, she noticed him linger longer, his eyes watching her fingers move, curiosity blooming alongside the wariness in his gaze. One evening, as Ava played a tune with a faster, almost playful rhythm, she saw Leo's foot tapping along, his face relaxed for the first time. She paused mid-song, the sudden silence startling. Leo looked up, eyes wide as if caught in the middle of something secret. "Do you like music?" Ava asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. Leo shifted, hesitant. My mama used to sing," he whispered, the words sounding strange and fragile as they left his lips. A shiver ran through him, as if speaking aloud might break something inside him. Ava's chest tightened, a bittersweet ache spreading. "She must have had a beautiful voice," she said, tucking the memory away as gently as she could. She didn't ask more. She didn't have to. The lost look in Leo's eyes spoke volumes. "Do you know any songs?" she continued, the question casual, almost offhand. Leo shook his head, then paused, uncertain. He cleared his throat, and a ghost of a smile appeared. "She sang a lullaby," he said, fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. "I don't remember all of it, just that it was soft, like rain." The way he said it, Ava could almost hear the echoes of that lullaby, notes hidden deep in the folds of Leo's memory, waiting to be found. A plan began to form in her mind, a spark kindling as she looked at the boy who, bit by bit, seemed to be finding himself again. "Maybe one day you'll remember it," she said, giving him a reassuring nod. "And when you do, I'll play it for you." The boy's eyes brightened for a heartbeat before dimming, the guarded expression returning. But it was enough for now, Ava thought. A small flame of trust was better than none at all. The following evening, Ava returned with not just her violin, but an old harmonica she had kept from childhood. Its brass was tarnished, and a small dent ran along one side, but it worked. She set it down beside Leo's usual spot on the bridge's edge and started playing again, this time a cheerful tune with lilting notes that beckoned like an open door. Leo's fingers inched toward the harmonica, hesitation battling with the spark of desire. He picked it up, weighing it in his small hands, and for a moment, the bridge wasn't just stone and shadows. It was a place that hummed with hope. Ava caught the movement from the corner of her eye, and her heart swelled as he lifted the harmonica to his lips and let out a shaky, tentative note. The sound wavered, thin and uncertain, but it was music all the same. Leo's face lit up with a mix of surprise and delight, and Ava's fingers danced over the strings, weaving his fragile notes into her song. For the first time, laughter, a small, breathless giggle, bubbled up from Leo's chest, warming the cool evening like the first ray of dawn. The town seemed different now, softer, with the sound of Ava's violin and Leo's tentative harmonica notes winding their way through the cobbled streets each evening. People began to stop and listen, their expressions changing from hurried and weary to curious and touched. Some dropped coins at Ava's feet. Others lingered, captivated by the unlikely duo playing songs that spoke more than words could. But as the nights grew colder, the change in weather brought with it an edge of urgency. Ava could see the deeper shivers in Leo's small frame, the way his fingers trembled despite being wrapped in the frayed edges of his blanket. He was running out of time, she realized. The cold wouldn't wait, and neither could she. One night, as Leo's notes wavered with more uncertainty than usual, Ava finished their song and took a step toward him. "Leo," she said, her voice steady but soft. He looked up, the vulnerability in his eyes sharp as broken glass. "I think it's time we found you somewhere warmer to sleep. The bridge isn't safe anymore." Leo's expression shifted, fear cracking through the tentative trust that had taken weeks to build. "No," he said, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, his voice firm with an edge of desperation. "I'm fine here. I can't go anywhere else." Ava's heart clenched, but she didn't step back. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to," she promised, kneeling to meet his eye level. The memory of her own nights on the edge of survival threatened to surface. Days when music was the only thing that kept her alive. "But you deserve better than this, Leo. Everyone deserves a place that feels safe." He shook his head, eyes brimming with a defiance that was more fragile than it looked. "Someone will come looking," he said, as if convincing himself. "Mama said, before everything went dark, she said to stay hidden until she came for me." The ache in Ava's chest turned into a sharp, painful twist. She reached out, her fingers hovering before they rested gently on his arm. He flinched at first, but didn't pull away. "What if she wants to find you somewhere safe?" Ava asked, watching the conflict ripple across his small face. "Wouldn't she be glad to see you warm and well?" For a moment, silence draped over them, broken only by the wind and the distant hum of the town. Finally, Leo's shoulders drooped, the fight slipping away. He gave a small, resigned nod, not quite meeting her gaze. The next morning, Ava took Leo to a shelter run by Mrs. Moreno, an elderly woman with eyes as sharp as her tongue, but a heart as generous as her meals. The moment they stepped inside, warmth enveloped them, smelling of cinnamon and old books. Mrs. Moreno raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she handed Leo a bowl of steaming oatmeal, watching with quiet approval as he ate in quick, hungry bites. "Thank you," Ava whispered to Mrs. Moreno, who gave a curt nod, eyes softening as she watched Leo. But as days passed, Ava began to notice things that made her pulse quicken with unease. Leo's sleep was restless, punctuated by nightmares that pulled gasping breaths from his chest. Words would tumble out in his sleep, broken phrases, names Ava didn't recognize, and a recurring whisper, "No, don't leave me." He was holding on to a past that seemed darker and more complicated than Ava had suspected. One evening, Ava played a lullaby, the notes weaving through the air like a warm embrace. Leo stirred, eyes fluttering as he woke. "I remember the fire," he said suddenly, voice barely audible. Ava's fingers faltered, the room seeming to still as he spoke. There was shouting, and Mama, she told me to run and not come back. Ava's heart pounded. Before she could ask more, the door of the shelter creaked open, the cold air sweeping in. A man stood there, tall and gaunt, with eyes that searched the room like a storm. The moment his gaze landed on Leo, they widened in recognition and disbelief. "Leo?" the man whispered, his voice cracking. Leo's eyes went wide with a mix of fear and something else, hope. Ava's breath caught as she stepped protectively in front of the boy. The truth of Leo's past was finally here, knocking on the fragile edges of the life they had built. The man stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with a strange, electric tension. His coat, heavy and worn, barely concealed the taut energy in his frame. Leo's eyes flickered between fear and recognition, his small body trembling. Ava stood her ground, positioning herself between Leo and the stranger. She could feel the boy's rapid breaths, hear the whisper of his heartbeat in the silence that gripped the room. "Leo," the man said again, his voice breaking on the syllable. It was more plea than call. He took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Mrs. Moreno, sensing the shift in the room, glanced over, her sharp eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Who are you?" Ava's voice was steady, but her fingers gripped the neck of her violin like it was a lifeline. She studied the man, taking in his gaunt cheeks, the deep shadows under his eyes, and the way he looked at Leo with something that bordered on desperation. "My name is Samuel," he said, his gaze locked on the boy who had tucked himself tightly behind Ava. "I'm his uncle." Leo gasped, the sound soft but cutting through the air like a knife. Ava felt him clutch the edge of her coat, his small fingers digging in as if to anchor himself to something real. "No," he whispered, a tremor shaking his voice. "No, you were gone. Mama said she said you weren't coming back." Samuel's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like a man on the verge of collapse. "I know, Leo. I know," he said, swallowing hard. "I didn't think I'd make it either. The fire, it took everything. I searched for you when I could, but the world is cruel to those who are broken and lost." The room fell into a fragile silence, only broken by the soft whimper from Leo. Ava's pulse roared in her ears, and she could feel the questions pressing at the edges of her mind. Who was Samuel, really? And what danger or truth had he brought with him? Why now? Ava's voice was low, not unkind, but unyielding. Why show up now, after all this time? Samuel's eyes met hers, full of regret and something deeper, a fear that ran marrow deep. "I didn't just come back for him," he admitted, his voice rough. "I came to make sure he's safe. You don't understand, there are people who—" A sudden crash outside cut him off, the sound of shouts echoing down the street. Ava flinched, her heart thundering as Mrs. Moreno hurried to the window, peering through the cracked pane. "What in the world?" she muttered, eyes wide. The door burst open before anyone could move, a man in a dark coat with eyes as sharp as winter stepping in. His gaze swept the room and locked on Leo. Ava's breath caught, the hair on the back of her neck rising as she realized what Samuel had meant. "There you are," the man said, a cruel smile curving his lips. He looked at Samuel, a glimmer of recognition sparking between them. "You led us right to him." Leo shrank back and Ava's heart twisted as she stepped forward, shielding him with her body. Samuel's jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides. "Stay back," he warned, voice quivering with fury and desperation. The air thickened, every second stretching into a taut string, ready to snap. "Leo, run!" Ava shouted, pushing him toward Mrs. Moreno, who grabbed the boy and pulled him into the kitchen. The man lunged, but Samuel moved faster, blocking his path. The room erupted into chaos, the clash of bodies and shouts ringing out as Ava reached for Leo, adrenaline roaring in her veins. Leo stumbled, eyes wide with panic, but then, through the noise, Ava's voice came steady and clear. "Leo, remember the song! Remember your mother's voice!" The boy's chest heaved, and something sparked in his eyes. A sliver of courage. He turned, watching as Ava and Samuel fought to keep the intruder at bay. The memory surged forward in his mind, the lullaby that had whispered through his dreams for so long. A single fragile note hummed in his throat as he clung to it, heart pounding like a drum. The room crackled with chaos as the struggle continued, shouts and the clatter of overturned furniture reverberating against the walls. Ava's breath came in short gasps, her fingers aching as she tried to pull Samuel back from the man whose eyes shone with cold intent. The intruder's grip was like iron, and every movement seemed to push them closer to a breaking point. Leo's voice, small and trembling, rose from the shadows where he stood clutching Mrs. Moreno's hand. The note came hesitantly at first, like a fragile ember in the dark, but grew steadier as he remembered the lullaby his mother had once sung. It was the same melody Ava had played so many nights by the bridge, a song of hope that wrapped around the fear and banished it, note by note. Samuel's head snapped toward Leo, eyes widening with a glimmer of recognition and surprise. The man in the dark coat faltered, the sudden sound catching him off guard. Ava seized the moment, shoving him back with all her strength. He stumbled, his gaze darting to Leo, whose voice, although thin and wavering, held a power that seemed to root everyone in place. The song, delicate and full of longing, filled the room, pushing back the shadows and the cold. Ava's vision blurred with unshed tears as she watched Leo sing, the boy's small body shaking but standing tall. The room, caught in the strange spell of the melody, seemed to still. Even the stranger's cruel expression cracked, confusion flickering across his features, as if the sound of that song stirred something buried deep and unwanted. Samuel took the opening, lunging forward and wrenching the man's arm behind his back. The two struggled, but Leo's song filled the space between them like a shield. The man snarled, eyes flashing with fury before Samuel finally forced him to the ground. A resounding thud followed, and the fight drained out of the room, leaving only the echoes of Leo's lullaby. The boy's voice quivered on the last note, breaking as he drew in a shaky breath. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. Samuel's chest rose and fell as he panted, his hold unyielding on the subdued intruder. Ava stepped toward Leo, her hands reaching out to cup his tear-streaked face, awe and pride shining in her eyes. "You remembered," she whispered, her voice breaking. Leo nodded, a small, brave smile cracking through the fear. "Mama said it would keep me safe," he said, the last word trembling into the quiet. Mrs. Moreno emerged from behind the kitchen counter, her eyes wide but glistening with relief. "That song?" she murmured, looking between Leo and Samuel. "It's a family song, isn't it?" Samuel's gaze met Ava's, his eyes softening with the weight of a truth that had long been hidden. He nodded, voice tight with emotion. "It was my sister's song. She taught it to him so he'd never be lost." The intruder's eyes, now dull and resigned, shifted toward the boy, and for the first time they reflected not menace but a hint of something else. Defeat, perhaps regret. Samuel hauled him to his feet, securing his arms and turning him toward the door. "You've done enough," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. As they left, Ava knelt down and pulled Leo into a tight embrace. His small arms wrapped around her, and she felt the thrum of his heartbeat against her chest. It was fast, frantic, but alive. "You're safe now," she whispered, the words a promise. Samuel returned moments later, shutting the door with finality and leaning against it, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He looked at Leo, then at Ava, a glimmer of gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Leo's eyes, tired but brighter now, found Ava's, and for the first time, the shadow of fear lifted. He was no longer the boy who hid under the bridge. He was the boy who had faced the darkness and found his song. The dawn light filtered through the cracked window panes of Mrs. Moreno's shelter, painting golden slants across the worn wooden floor. The air was thick with the quiet aftermath of the night before, but a newfound stillness had settled over the room, one not of fear, but of calm. Ava sat by the window, watching Leo as he dozed, curled under a heavy quilt. His small frame rose and fell with the rhythm of deep, dreamless sleep. Samuel stood nearby, his silhouette tall and weary in the soft light. He had cleaned up, shedding the grime of the night, but the lines of worry and exhaustion still mapped his face. He glanced at Leo, the boy who had once been a memory too painful to hold, now returned to him in a moment that felt both miraculous and fragile. "He remembers more now," Ava said, breaking the silence, her voice hushed. She didn't look away from Leo, the warmth in her eyes shadowed by worry. "But what was all of this, Samuel? Who was that man?" Samuel rubbed his rough hands over his face, the weight of the explanation pressing down on him. "The fire that took his parents was no accident," he said, his voice carrying a sorrow Ava had only glimpsed before. "My sister, Leo's mother, found out something she shouldn't have, something dangerous. Those men, they came to silence her. I was away, working, when it happened. I came back to ruins, no trace of them but whispers and smoke." Ava's throat tightened as she listened, pieces of Leo's fragmented nightmares falling into place. Samuel looked at her, eyes dark and unyielding. "I spent years trying to find out what happened, who survived. When I heard about a boy who might have been found wandering the outskirts, I followed every lead I could. It wasn't until I saw that article, the one with your picture and mention of a boy who stayed by the bridge, that I knew." Ava remembered that article. a local write-up about her music and how people said it seemed to pull them through hard days. The thought that it had led Samuel here, that it had set this chain of events into motion, made her pulse quicken. "And now?" she asked, voice steady. "Is he safe now?" Samuel nodded, but the worry didn't fully leave his expression. "I'll make sure of it. The men responsible have scattered and the authorities are involved now. But more than anything, Leo's song, that lullaby, is known only to us. It's why they couldn't find him before. It was his mother's way of telling him to stay hidden, stay safe, until someone could come for him." Leo stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked at the room, sleep slipping away as he focused on the figures around him. A tentative smile broke across his face as he saw Ava and Samuel, a warmth spreading through his chest that he hadn't felt in as long as he could remember. "Good morning," Ava said, her own smile soft and full of relief. Leo sat up, rubbing his eyes. The fear that had haunted him seemed smaller now, dwarfed by the safety he felt here, surrounded by people who had fought for him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He looked at Samuel, questions brimming but held back by a cautious hope. "You're really my uncle?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Samuel knelt, his eyes level with Leo's, and placed a calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, Leo, and I'm here to make sure you never have to hide again." Leo's eyes glistened, and he swallowed hard, nodding as if he were finally allowing himself to believe it. Ava watched them, a warmth blooming in her chest that mingled with the bittersweet ache of knowing she had played a part in this, of knowing the bridge that had once been a refuge of fear had become the place where hope found its way back. Mrs. Moreno entered the room, a tray of warm bread and tea in hand, her sharp eyes softening at the sight of the three of them. "Time for breakfast," she announced, her voice carrying a note of finality and comfort. "We all need to start fresh today." Leo grinned, a real, unguarded smile. And as they sat together, the first rays of morning light washing over them, the weight of the past began to shift. It wasn't gone, but it no longer held them hostage. They had found each other, and with that, they could begin to heal. Weeks passed, and the biting chill of winter gradually gave way to the first whispers of spring. The streets of Riverton, once wrapped in the silence of frost and shadow, came alive with the chatter of people and the rustle of leaves on budding branches. Ava stood near her usual spot by the bridge, her violin tucked under her arm as she watched the river ripple gently beneath the morning sun. The memories of that fateful night still lingered, but they no longer carried the weight of fear. Instead, they were reminders of resilience, of connections forged in moments of crisis. A familiar laugh caught her attention, light and free, cutting through the morning air like a song. She turned to see Leo racing Samuel up the small hill by the shelter, his cheeks flushed with the excitement of the chase. Samuel let the boy win, stumbling on purpose and falling back with an exaggerated groan that made Leo laugh harder, his face a picture of pure joy. Ava's heart warmed at the sight. Leo's transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. The once skittish boy who hid in the shadows now stood tall, confidence blooming in the safety and love he had rediscovered. Samuel had proven to be both fierce and tender, navigating the strange new role of guardian with unwavering determination. The two had become inseparable, bound not just by blood, but by survival and hope. "Are you going to play today?" Leo's voice broke into her thoughts as he ran up to her, breathless and bright-eyed. He clutched the harmonica she had given him, its brass polished from use. "Of course," Ava said, smiling as she adjusted her violin. "But only if you'll join me." Leo's eyes sparkled with a blend of pride and mischief. "I'll try not to play too many wrong notes," he joked, and Ava's laughter joined his, weaving warmth into the crisp air. Samuel approached, hands tucked into his coat pockets, a smile softening his sharp features. "Go on, Leo. Show her what you've been practicing," he encouraged, his voice touched with affection. Leo nodded, stepping beside Ava and lifting the harmonica to his lips. The song they played was simple, but it was full of life, a melody that echoed the journey they had taken together. Ava's bow danced across the strings, and Leo's harmonica filled in the spaces, the notes bright and sure. Passers-by paused to listen, smiles breaking across their faces as the music swept over them. As the final note faded, the applause was warm and spontaneous. Leo beamed, looking up at Ava with an expression that spoke more than words ever could. It was a look of gratitude, of belonging, of knowing that in this small corner of the world, he was safe and cherished. Samuel stepped forward, clapping Leo on the shoulder. "You were brilliant," he said, voice low but full of pride. Leo ducked his head, a shy grin breaking through. Ava set her violin down and knelt, meeting Leo's eyes. "You found your song, Leo, and you've shared it with all of us." Leo's smile grew, and he reached out to hug her, the gesture fierce and full of trust. Ava held him, feeling the last threads of winter's cold give way to the warmth of spring, a season they could now face together. "Ready for lunch?" Samuel asked, breaking the moment with a playful nudge to Leo's arm. Leo nodded eagerly, the harmonica tucked into his pocket like a precious secret. They started toward the shelter, their laughter blending with the hum of the town as it moved through its day. As they walked, Ava picked up her violin and followed, the notes of their song still echoing in her mind. She glanced back at the bridge where it had all begun, where a boy once hid in the shadows, drawn out by the sound of hope. It was a reminder that even in the coldest corners, music and kindness could light the way. And so they moved forward step by step, the memory of that dark winter, now a story of courage and new beginnings, told with every note that echoed under the old bridge. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and share this tale of hope and courage with someone who could use a reminder that even in the darkest times there is light. Leave a comment below about your favorite moment or a story of your own, and don't forget to share it with friends.